And will benefit the rich.
More money into the economy, stimulate the economy, just as the Australians are doing over there, so that we can create jobs, get the economy back on track. Alongside that, we have a real focus, of course, on ensuring that the border is properly secure, but we can start getting some movement across that if we have a decent agency in place and some good quality testing and tracing. And then, we'll also invest in good quality infrastructure that will create jobs in the meantime, and also leave New Zealand in a better place to be more productive in the years to come.
Grant Robertson, how would you bust the recession?
Yeah, well, look, obviously this is about an investment by the government alongside the private sector. We've obviously put on the table a plan for a huge boost to infrastructure spending, the building of 8,000 more public housing places, the initiatives that we're doing to create jobs in our Jobs for Nature program. So that's short-term, immediate job stimulus. 11,000.
How many of those jobs are turning up yet, Grant? Didn't you see the news today?
Building up the importance of our trade training and free apprenticeships proposals. That's absolutely critical. I suspect actually some of that vegetation work might well have come from our worker redeployment program. I went and visited some of those in the Central Hawke's Bay, and people are picking up skills, getting opportunities for training through the work that we've done to invest in that. So this is a long-term project. It's got to be underpinned by strong public services, and a sugar hit style approach that Paul's offering up there around those tax cuts is not what we need when we have to grow our way sustainably out of a recession.
We do need a sugar hit, but it should hit the poor most. That's what a temporary UBI would do.
People some of their own money back, and they might think that's a good thing.
It's just not affordable though, Paul, is it? That's the problem.
It's all question of choices, and
it is,
we can make some real progress.
In your fiscal plan,
we can make some real progress.
You're using the money that's been put aside in case there's a resurgence for those tax cuts, aren't you?
Well, we're using some of the COVID fund, which is set up to help deal with the economic consequences of COVID.
And
one of the economic consequences is a slow economy.
It is irresponsible to do that in the face of a world where what we saw, 1 million cases in the last 3 days in the rest of the world. And you've got a desperate attempt here with a sugar hit policy that won't do anything for the long-term sustainable growth of our economy whatsoever.
Well, what's irresponsible is to promise to build 100,000 houses and manage to get to 604.
Let's talk about...
Our Reserve Bank is begging the government to spend money right now.
You've got here this fiscal plan
where
you've been saying... I'm happy to be in charge of it. where you've been saying that there's $9 billion. Which you told me on the weekend, I've got $9 billion. You don't. You've spent it on the tax cuts.
No,
yes, you have. It's right
there's
here.
14 billion
it's right
left.
there.
There's 14 billion left aside from the COVID fund. We're going to spend $5 billion on the tax cuts. There's $9 billion.
No, you're not.
That's left
over.
over.
You're spending $9 billion on them.
We'll come back to the tax. We will come back to the tax cuts later. But for the moment, I want to come back to unemployment.
Yeah.
And it's expected to peak at 7.8%. You've both said that this is concerning. Yet the Māori unemployment rate, up until this last quarter, hadn't spent one day below that in the last decade. The unemployment rate for Māori women rose even higher, topping 16.6% in 2016. So Grant Robertson, 6.7% of Māori unemployed, just 23,000 people. How many of them can you get in a job in the next 3 years, and how will you do it?
Yeah, so big focus for us, and we put it in the budget package around Māori trades training, a $50 million fund there set up specifically to target that. He Potama Rangatahi, which is a program that's actually been working really well in the regions of New Zealand. We're now going to put that into the cities of New Zealand as well. We've got a focus around government procurement and supporting Māori businesses to be able to be involved in that. One of the successes, and I'll admit that this started under the previous government with Peter Sharples, has been working with the NZTE and Māori businesses as exporting businesses as well. We've started to see real progress there in things like Manu Kahani, making better use of Māori land in particular, and again funding both the Māori Land Court to be a more efficient process, but also then support via the Provincial Growth Fund for actual development on that Māori land as well. So all of those things build up to a real focus for us on making sure that not only the overall job creation programs are supporting Māori, but there's actually a real target there. And we have brought those numbers down over time as well.
much so.
Paul Goldsmith, under the last national government, the gap between the Māori unemployment rate, the general unemployment rate widened. Now, if you're Finance Minister, what would you do to ensure that didn't happen again?
Well, look, the real focus has to be on the creation of jobs, and this government has a real focus on government programs to buy jobs, and so Shane Jones will spend a whole lot of money, $100 million on marae, and I heard Grant saying, well, it'll create a few jobs to build those maraes. And the point that we'd make is, yes, short-term government purchasing of jobs to do particular contracts can be useful during a crisis, but the real thing we need as a country is sustainable long-term jobs that are created fundamentally by New Zealanders hiring other New Zealanders. It's the tens of thousands of businesses, large and small, feeling confident to take on that extra person. And this government, at every turn, has been making it more difficult for those small businesses to take on extra people. We've been putting up costs. And have a second week of sick leave? Yeah, sure, why not? No trouble. We'll put up the minimum wage? Yeah, why not? We'll just keep on piling on the costs with no connection between the profitability and the ability of those businesses to survive. So what we've got to focus on is improving the productivity and backing the private sector investment to create jobs.
And a temporary UBI would help people move in and out of work in this uncertain workforce.
Encouraging those, well, yes, of course. And the critical thing is to have a strong economy that creates those jobs. And if you make it more difficult for people to take on that extra person, and if you say that you can't have a 90-day trial, well, who does that hurt most? It hurts the people who don't have a working background, who might be coming from not having the professional skills and qualifications, and to have an employer take a chance on that person. They're more likely to do that if they've got the flexibility, and they've taken away...
Well, right now is not the time to be increasing the barriers to work.
Just on jobs, I'd like to just hew over to wages for a minute, because wages growth in New Zealand has been low. There's been a general problem of low wage economy and low productivity in New Zealand. 3 decades, right? Now, what would you do, Grant Robertson, to try and lift New Zealand's wages? What would you do through economic reform?
Well, the first thing is that actually in the 3 years that we've had up until COVID, we actually did see private sector wage growth the best it had been in a decade. And a big part of that is about investing in the big drivers of productivity, which is around infrastructure and modern infrastructure. It's around research and development.
Made no progress on infrastructure.
Well, we actually have.
You've stopped all the infrastructure.
Modern, but also, Paul, on research and development, where under the national government we were consistently spending underneath the half of the OECD average. So we actually did practical things there to boost Callaghan innovation, to bring R&D tax credits in, and in skills as well. These things are not simple. They're made up of a network of policies that actually we have put in place in the 3 years and we will continue to build on.
Paul Goldsmith?
Yeah, look,
these guys have been talking about this stuff
R&D
for 20 years and nothing's changed.
It's sad that they've turned the entire polytech sector upside down and shaken it by its feet.
You left most of the polytechs and going into deficit.
Well, we can talk about that in great detail. But
I had to write out a cheque for $100 million for Unitech because under your government it was going downhill.
But the thing that makes a real difference for productivity actually is a whole lot of things. It's like investing in infrastructure. I think of the humble concrete mixer in Auckland. Used to be able to do 5 return trips a day. Now can only do 3. The productivity's held back. And so, Julian Genter and her cones and slower speed limits, all those things make it more difficult. When you deal...
Immediate bell.
Hang on, that bell was far too short. The other thing is a fundamental driver of productivity is business investment. You're investing in new plant and machinery, and that's why a big part of our tax plan is increasing the rate of depreciation to encourage businesses to invest.
And that's why we need to shift people away from speculating on housing into investing in businesses.
Because there are a few of them, right? So there are a few of them to talk about because they're everywhere, it seems. The government accounts published in the preview just before the election, which is currently underway, show deficits stretching out for 14 years. Grant Robertson, I'd like to know whether you think, as Finance Minister, will you ever run another surplus?
Yeah, I think I would, and obviously within the budget, within the pre-fu, you've got the projection period, which is a straight line calculation based on growth being at about 2.4%, productivity being at about 1.4%. We can do much better than that, and the policies that we put up are going to do much better than that. It's also worth noting that while we start with a deficit up at around 10%, that comes down to less than 1% during that period of time. But we've also got to be honest with New Zealanders here, and And on the 17th of March, I stood up in Parliament and I said there would be an extended period of debt and deficits over a number of years. That's because this is a 1 in 100 year economic shock. And the option is either to undertake austerity policies where you underfund public services, or to do a balanced approach as we have to be able to reduce debt over time, get ourselves back into surplus, but not sacrifice our health and education systems.
So
Debt is not the problem,
So
the
if
quality
you
of
win the
spending
election
is the
and,
problem,
you return
and
to office,
both of these
you'll be
guys
putting
are
together your
proposing
budget policy
infrastructure
statement for,
projects which
December.
are crap.
Will that show a road back to surplus?
Well, in the end, those numbers, as you know, are dictated by the Treasury. I don't actually get to say exactly what they'll be, but I am confident with the policies that we've got that we will find our way back to surplus over time. But it is not going to happen right away, because the
It's not gonna happen ever
way to get
under your
there,
plan.
the way to get there would be Paul's plan, which is underfunding health and education
nonsense.
consistently and
Nonsense.
leaving the service gaps that we inherited when we came into office.
So now moving to that. So Paul Goldsmith, you do have a road back to surplus, but it does come at a cost. $51 billion less in new operating spending over 14 years.
Yeah.
You've left $800 million to allocate to all new public spending pressures in your first budget. The amount of money that was allocated to DHBs in the last budget, the one we're currently talking about, was $980 million.
Yep.
You've left $800 million to go to new hospital funding, schools, the lot. How are you going to divvy that money up?
So what we've got is we're going to allow for $1.8 billion of new spending each year.
But the
And
first
so
budget,
the first year we've already allocated quite a few things. We've said we're going to put extra money into Pharmac, we're going to put extra money into schools, and so some money has already been allocated.
$1 billion.
We still have some money left over. And the point I would make is when we come to draw up our budget, the first thing, of course, we'll do is take a look at some of the incredible waste that's been delivered by this government. And there is a huge amount of opportunities. If we don't have Shane Jones in the cabinet, we'll have an enormous amount of money.
700.
If
So
we
the
don't
average
have,
spend on health
Phil Twyford
for
in
5
our
years,
budget, we'll have an enormous
including
amount.
budgets done by Bill English and Stephen
Sure.
Joyce, the average spend on health was $767 million.
And we'll find the money.
You've then got about 30 million odd more
Yep.
to be able to spend on
Yep.
education,
Yeah.
on the police.
And that's
you
before,
can't do it.
That's
It
what I'm saying.
doesn't
You can't.
add up.
It does add up. It does add up. And-
Paul's right that there is waste, but this is
the
not
line
the
he's
time
putting is
for
unless National
austerity
commits to
as
spend every cent
National and
that Labor's
particularly
going to spend,
ACT
somehow
are
there's
proposing.
austerity.
No,
Which
I
is
just
nonsense,
want you to
because-
fund hospitals properly.
Because that's
That's all.
spending like no tomorrow.
Just on the way. So
the
where
quality
would
of the
you
spending that counts.
find those savings?
Well, look, I mean, you just everywhere you turn, you see this government spending money in a very poor fashion. I think
Is there any specific part of the government accounts that you think is wasteful, that you would specifically say that goes to a DHB?
Yeah, for example, right now they're spending about $3,000 renting houses for a week because they're paying at motel rates at $180 a room or whatever it is per night.
You're only going to fix that if you build more houses.
No, the very poor
Where are they
quality-
gonna go?
Well, you'd actually get it better organised so that you weren't getting
Oh,
ripped
right,
off by
better
people
organised.
flogging off
Okay.
bad houses.
Didn't
But
notice that for
there's
9
many
years, but good
opportunities. There's many opportunities to find savings once we have a look at what's underneath the bonnet in this government.
3,000 a week isn't quite enough to fund the DHB.
No, but it's a big example of how reckless they have been with spending. And we see those examples all across the government. And take, for example, that he talked about the $1.1 billion being spent on shooting possums and planting flax bushes around the country. Now, not all of that is going to be spent, and it may well be that we can use that money more wisely for health.
It's one of the areas where you've found savings in your fiscal planning, Grant Robertson, is things like light rail. Now, you've got the Ministry of Transport, which has given you an assessment of the 2 proposals for light rail. You've seen those proposals?
Yes, I have.
And you've seen the numbers attached to them?
Well, there have been some numbers attached to them, but there's more work to do on those.
Right, so the Ministry of Transport's gone away. It's been, 3 years since the policy was announced. We've been in government for 3 years, and you don't have a final number on how much it will cost.
It will depend on the nature of the proposal.
Light rail
So
is
what we were
such a
looking at was
mess.
a proposal that was effectively a public-public partnership, or one delivered through the more normal ways of funding transport expenditure. What we do have is $1.8 billion of seed funding within ATAP.
It'll
The
cost
decision
$10 billion.
then comes from there as to exactly what kind of financing arrangement you make. That decision is still to be taken.
The government couldn't
This is
decide what kind
possibly
of
gonna be
light
the
rail it
biggest
wanted to do.
infrastructure project in New Zealand's in recent history. you go into an election, people are already voting, and voters don't actually know how much it will cost.
That's because we still have to decide on the final way in which it's
We've had
both
3 years.
designed and delivered.
It was supposed to be
and
delivered in
financed.
2021.
And so we've got the $1.8 billion of seed funding in there. People can see that. When we get to be back in government, we'll be able to sit down and look again at the best way to do it. I don't think there's anything wrong with actually looking at options like a public-public partnership using the super fund. Paul doesn't want to pay into the super fund anymore, but actually it is a very useful vehicle for us to think about for infrastructure development.
Could I just say, but he comes from Wellington, but there's not a soul in Auckland who thinks that the number one priority for transport should be a slow tram
There's also
down
a
Dominion
massive
Road.
number of other projects going on in Auckland,
Well, not-
as you know, Paul.
Well,
Let's do
Look at
independent
ACAP,
business
because you left us
cases,
with a
gentlemen,
$7
and then we
billion
can
hole in
see
that
which
we
of the
had to
best
fill in as
projects
well.
to
They
fund.
So there's a
stopped
heap
all
of
the
different
projects.
transport
But neither of them want to
which
do
one
that. They just
can
want
be
to
like.
It's been a
play
huge
with their
distraction.
pet projects.
Well, we'll go on to, which is like as good a place as any, when we're talking and digging in holes, whether roads or budgets or anything else. But we've asked both leaders to come armed with questions for each other. And we'd like to have the first of those questions. And Paul Goldsmith, would you like to put your question with Grant Robertson?
Mr. Robertson.
Mr. Goldsmith.
Can you, with a straight face, tell us right here, right now, that of all the spending from Shane Jones on the Provincial Growth Fund that you signed off, that the taxpayers got good value for money?
Yeah, I can say that the taxpayer has had excellent value for money from projects that I've seen all around New Zealand. I was in the Gisborne region today, and in that region, people who actually support your party, Paul, were saying to us today just how important the investments in that region had been. I went and visited an engineering firm today who have been doing, in Gisborne, the engineering for the Opotiki Wharf that's been funded through the PGF. That has created jobs. There's been about 6,500 hours of work in that engineering firm, straight out of a Provincial Growth Fund project. Just because the National Party has no vision for the regions of New Zealand doesn't mean you should bag the fund.
That's about local authority
You'll
funding,
get it,
Grant,
get it.
not.
Question
You
later.
don't need a
Grant
provincial
Robertson,
growth fund.
So my first
do
question
that.
to Paul, so we can get this absolutely clear, of the $14 billion that was left on the table in case of a resurgence for COVID-19, how much of that have you allocated in your fiscal plan?
Well, there's all 14 billion of it. 5 billion is going to go to the tax cuts. 4 billion has been set aside for potential use over the next 2 years, and the remainder we're not intending to spend, but we may have to spend if we have to.
Am I allowed to follow up?
No.
No. We'll come back to this, but we would like to.
Where's
now,
yours?
Exactly.
What are you doing with yours?
The 14 billion.
Yeah.
It's there in case there's a resurgence, Paul.
Yes.
Look around the
Yes.
world. There's COVID everywhere, Paul.
And did you notice that the World Health Organization today said we should not be going back into lockdowns, and we won't be going back into lockdowns, and we're not going to be paying big wage subsidies, so hopefully
Is that
we
right?
won't need to
All
use
right,
it.
we'll let people know that they won't be supported by national government if there has to be further
Of course we'll
restrictions.
be supported, don't be
This is actually, speaking of lockdowns, it's a very good chance to now go to our second question from the wider Stuff audience, which is from a small business owner in Auckland.
Hi, my name is Matt Johnson. We have a small independently owned furniture importing and wholesaling business which has been affected by the COVID situation like many others. My question to you is, what kind of assurances are you prepared to offer small and medium businesses to ease the economic pain as we move into recession?
Grant Robertson, what are you going to do to help small business?
Yeah, look, we've been backing them all the way through COVID-19, through the wage subsidy scheme, through the small business cash flow loan scheme, which we're now extending out further. We also know that there's been a real desire for people to be able to get on top of things like merchant fees, so we're going to regulate those. And we also, and this is based on feedback from the small business community, it's e-commerce and it's trading online that's really helped people get through this. So we're offering digital training vouchers, further business advice support, along with all of the tax changes that we've previously announced. The best thing we can do for those people is make sure that we do never go back up the alert levels, and that means maintaining the strong border and the strong public health response that we've had.
Paul Goldsmith, small business, what can they expect?
Well, I was talking to a small business owner last week in Epsom who was at her wit's end, just thinking, saying to me, okay, well look, half of my costs of my business is wage and staff costs, and this government has just suddenly decided to double the sick leave. And you know, that'll be great, but am I supposed to pay for it? How am I supposed to pay for it? And then they're going to put up the minimum wage again. They put it up in April, when we had no revenue at all, and they're going to put it up again. Now, I want to pay my people higher wages, but I can't afford to. How do I do it? How am I going to survive? And so every week there are many businesses that are struggling to stay afloat, and this government just keeps on piling on the costs as if they're some sort of ATM machine.
So what are the three things that you would do to help New Zealand business come out of COVID?
Stop making their life more difficult. That's the first thing you should do. Well, that's the critical thing. And then we put an extra nearly $5 billion into the economy over the next couple of years with our short-term tax relief coming in on the 1st of December. $3,000 into the hands of somebody on the average income. And that'll help stimulate the economy and get things ticking along. And then also we'll rapidly increase depreciation for when those small businesses buy a little piece of plant or machinery, a new coffee machine or something. They'll be able to write that off instantly against any profit that they make, and that'll help them invest and become more productive.
The top would abolish provisional taxation that would help businesses invest in digital technology, would help them improve energy efficiency. Good for the business bottom line, good for the environment.
We're going to be ring fencing part of that for people to start their own businesses and use that, which I think is incredibly important for them. We also have
UBI
a
would do that
scheme
too.
within the write-off for assets as well, along with the building depreciation, commercial building depreciation coming in, and all of the tax changes that we can support. But again, the best thing we can do for business, and we proved this during July in particular, is be at level 1. The New Zealand economy was operating about 2% of where it was in July 2019, according to the New Zealand Activity Index. So keeping that strong eye on the ball on the public health approach will continue to be the best approach for business and the economy.
I'd like to move on to larger businesses now and foreign direct investment. Now, Labor has made it more difficult and more onerous for overseas investors to put their money into New Zealand businesses.
Except
Will
for
that
forestry.
in this new COVID environment?
I presume you mean the earlier Overseas Investment Act changes. I mean, the focus there was on making sure that we protected iconic New Zealand land, that we made sure that New Zealand's interests through the national interest test, which is common in Australia, as you well know, Luke, was here in New Zealand. So I don't believe it puts us in any less strong position. And in fact, we had the Bloomberg survey this week of 700 executives who said that New Zealand was the top place for them, for where they did want to put their money and invest. So we'll keep continuing to encourage.
But they can't get the money in, that's the problem.
To encourage foreign direct investment in the productive side of the economy. What we want to avoid is it being in the speculative side of the economy, which is why we put in place, for example, the ban on offshore buyers buying residential property.
And what would a Labor government do to go out and get productive foreign investment?
Yep. So the investment we put aside.
So locals are allowed to speculate under Labor.
To be able to actually go out and get investor attraction. We are getting a lot of interest from NZTE right now for people coming and saying they want to be here. In the middle of this time, Paul, Microsoft decided to open the data centre, but can't be quite as bad as you're making out, can it?
And look, but the only point I'd make is during the COVID crisis, they brought in tougher foreign investment rules so that any...
Same ones as your mates in Aussie boys.
Well, good luck to them.
Right. So ScoMo was wrong?
So they brought in these new rules that make it, any new investment coming in has to go through a notification regime and hoops of fire. And it just makes it more difficult, put sand in the gears of businesses
just
bringing
not true.
Money in. It does. It does make it more difficult.
It
and
doesn't.
So we need to be welcoming of investment. This whole country is being built on foreign investment, coming in and creating opportunities and jobs. And we need to make that easier to happen.
We'd like to move on now to growth stimulus.
I'd hear what Marty's saying about
and one
that.
of the key differences really between both of your economic approaches is the question of what spurs growth. So, Paul Goldsmith, your central plan is a significant 16-month temporary tax cut, while Grant Robertson's is much more of a state-led retraining skills program infrastructure, some of which started pre-COVID. Paul Goldsmith, why do you think your plan of tax cuts is superior?
Well, because, look, we trust New Zealanders to figure out for themselves how to create the jobs and expand their businesses. Our opponents seem to think that government knows best, and it's ministers Phil Twyford and Grant Robertson can decide where we need to invest our money and where we're going to grow. And we actually think we trust New Zealanders to make those decisions and to make it easier for them. So we put more money back in their pockets, and then we have a real focus on encouraging private sector investment, which is about keeping taxes low. It's about pushing back against the overwhelming tide of regulation that is swamping so many businesses.
They're giving money
Making
to
it
the
more,
rich people who won't spend it
more
and won't
predictable
stimulate
about,
the economy.
where things are going, and we've seen many examples during this government where the government has acted in a way that was hard to predict. The oil and gas decision's one, what's happening in Ihumāto's another, where nobody can work out what is going on, and that undermines confidence and willingness to invest. And then finally on that foreign investment. And then we continue to invest in good quality infrastructure. So you put those three things together, low tax, real...
Neither party is investing in good quality infrastructure. Neither of them have business cases.
And we'll get the economy growing.
Well, it is because it actually recognises the world we're living in. So what the preview showed us was actually that actually in the Paul. What the preview showed us was that in the short term, the New Zealand economy was actually outperforming where most people expected it to be. The real focus is the medium and the long term when we get, unfortunately, a continued global slowdown. So that's why our focus is on partnering with the private sector. And COVID-19 has been a really good example of why the kind of government Paul's talking about that sits on the sidelines is not actually what's needed. Private sector has been working with us all the way through. So we will invest in skills, we will invest in infrastructure, we will invest in R&D because they are the things that will give us sustainable growth. But we'll also recognise that actually meeting our climate change obligations is an opportunity for us to grow high-paying jobs in making sure that we are the people developing that new technology. All of what Paul's been describing to you is backward looking. It's trickle-down economics. It doesn't work. What we need to do is invest now alongside the private sector.
And I'd love to see Grant Robertson go to Kawerau, to the people at the Tasman Pulp and Paper. Go to the South and to talk to T.Y. Point. Go up to Marsden Point. Go to New Zealand Steel and tell them that their jobs are the jobs of the past. And so you should go and go somewhere else. They're all under threat, and they're being made more difficult by a lot of your government's decisions. And those jobs, thousands of jobs, are under threat. And you can just say in Pine, oh, by the way, we'll get into hydrogen.
So when Bill English was the Minister of Finance, Bill English said to Rio Tinto, don't come back for direct subsidies anymore. You're all in for them?
No, but I think we need to have a decent conversation.
So you're not going to protect those jobs.
Well, we are willing to have a decent conversation.
And so are we.
Neither Labour nor National prepared for Rio Tinto to leave Tiwai, so both of them are full of it.
Because we do need to start taking seriously the fact that not only does New Zealand need to meet its climate change obligations, that we have to be working now to create the job opportunities that are there.
Why didn't you start building the infrastructure when you came in 2017, Grant?
Through decarbonising our transport fleet. You have no plan whatsoever for that.
Oh, well, you promised to have...
Where's your plan for decarbonising the transport fleet, Grant?
That's not true.
Now,
none.
17. I think there might be 18.
No.
I think mainly ministerial's gone.
Just on this issue, I mean, in the current environment, climate change risks being forgotten as the short-term emergency crowds out the longer-term importance. Now, climate's not traditionally seen as part of the finance minister's job, but how important is it to economic recovery?
It is important that it's important that New Zealand is, as a country that exports around the world trading on a clean green image, can maintain and sustain that image and be seen to be doing its part internationally. And that's why National has been a constructive partner in coming up with a way for New Zealand to be able to present itself as a country that does its bit. Where we differ from this government is the Greens and Labour want to be way out in the front.
We just want to actually do something to meet the targets.
Yeah, no, but we
just having a target's not enough.
We recognise that we need to be in pace with our trading partners and based on science. But one thing, it's easy to say, and we'll come to this eventually. It's easy for them to say, well, we're going to be 100% renewable on our electricity by 2030. Well, you've got to explain how you're going to do that and what it's going to cost, because that is going to cost an arm and a leg.
True, Paul, that is the wrong target.
Pay for their electricity or for the government.
Your stimulus is very road heavy, though. The $31 billion transport package is very road heavy.
There's a lot of public transport in that.
It's mainly roads. What do you think the
that.
Climate Change Commission is going to say about that stimulus? Do you think they're going to give it a clean bill of health when it comes time to implement it?
I'm sure they will. I'm sure they'll look at what is one of the most ambitious investments in infrastructure in our history, where we connect the 2.5 million people between Whangarei, Hamilton and Tauranga, half the population of New Zealand, connecting them properly with 4-lane highways is basic infrastructure that should have been done a long time ago.
Have you done the geotechnical work on a tunnel through the Brindewins? I think you should talk to people up there about how they think that might... Oh, it's stage 2.
Well, it's better than what you're producing. You always dismiss that as the Holloway Highway.
We have an incredible opportunity with COVID to prepare for 2050 to meet our climate reductions targets. Neither of these guys has taken that into account with their proposals.
It's for building transport, not taking money out to pay for the rest of your capital works. What projects will go from the $10 billion that you have to take out?
Well, the whole point is that half of the projects we're doing are good busways and public transport things, which are supposed to be funded by the fund, and that's what it's all for.
So no community's going to lose anything. No community's going to lose anything. No, it's not petty politicking. It's making numbers add up.
We want it.
And it doesn't do it in here.
It does make up.
I'll just stop you there. While we're talking about projects, I mean, Grant Robertson, you've had an emphasis on shovel-ready projects, stuff the government can fund and we can get cracking on and
they made no progress.
Boost employment and get demand going. But how do you ensure that these projects that are being rolled out now really add to New Zealand's long-term productivity? And
exactly. Shovel-ready doesn't mean what's in the best interests of our future generations.
How many trains have been on
it? The Green School, I mean.
Yeah, but look, obviously all of these projects have been assessed via Crown Infrastructure Partners, which is an organisation that the previous government has done a great job of rolling out ultra-fast broadband. We're using them, and they're making sure that each of the projects meets certain goals. Money gets given as they meet the goals, as they go through them. So I'm confident we'll be able to get good value for money. And a lot of those projects are going to be based not only in things like vertical construction, but also starting to work towards those climate change goals as well.
Paul Goldsmith,
be transparent, Grant, and show us these business cases, and we might believe you.
Infrastructure package is that New Zealand's a small country, and there's only so much stuff you can build at the same time. Otherwise, there's big cost blowouts and inflation.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how will you get the balance between stimulating the economy and not having massive cost blowouts?
Well, that's why it's critical to have a pipeline of work, and that's why we've signalled 2 decades of investment so that the industry can build up.
The crucial thing here is the chopping and changing between recent governments is what's increased costs in recent years. We need to have a depoliticised method of selecting our infrastructure projects.
So that the industry can gear up.
This politicking is the problem.
Working in the industry, and they know where they're going over the next 15 years. That's what we need as a country, and that's why we supported their infrastructure commission, and we just wish that the way that they went about infrastructure actually followed, because they set up the Infrastructure Commission, and then you had Shane Jones sort of going off, sort of making stuff up on the hoof, according to his New Zealand.
Which is exactly what you and Judith and Chris Bishop have been doing too, Paul.
Which the industry had asked for 9 years and you didn't do.
And it was one good thing you've done.
Oh, there you go. Very good.
Well
Thank you, Paul.
Unity ticket. We just might come back to tax for a minute. Now, Grant Robertson, you're proposing to increase the top rate of personal income tax to 38 cents
39.
and the dollar for all income.
39. I don't want the whole truth.
39. My apologies. Under all income earned over $180,000 per year,
which will increase house prices, by the way.
The balance right. Now, what's the right balance? What's fair? And how did you get there?
Well, we looked at what we were facing with COVID and realised that obviously along with the enormous program of borrowing that we've had to do and that Paul's acknowledged had to be done, we also were asking the top 2% of New Zealanders to pay a little bit more to be able to help us provide the public services that we need, make sure that we keep debt under control, and it is a balance. We came to that because we thought that the top 2% was a reasonable number. And
the wealthiest New Zealanders don't pay the top rate of income tax.
Well, look, I mean, their proposition to the voting public is vote for us and we'll make somebody else pay more tax. The problem with that is that a government that can't control its spending will eventually come after you as well. And that's what the issue that we've been talking about today. The Greens, of course, want even more tax. And when they come to do any negotiations, well, it's not making it up at all. They want a wealth tax. They want higher income taxes. And they will
want to get rid of the winter energy payment. Are you going to do that?
And there'll be an excuse.
You're going to get rid of the winter energy
payment?
payment?
They'll have an excuse to come back after more tax. And the reality is that tax is related to spending. And you can only go on what you've seen. And so let's go back to when this government came in. They said that they'd have 1.8 billion or 1.9 billion extra spending in 2019. That was the allowance. And then within 2 years, they spent $3.8 billion. Actually,
And you know
on the budget.
what?
They
At
more
that
than
time,
doubled
we
their
reduced
spending.
debt and we had a surplus.
Well, that's
we
because you
spent
inherited
money because we managed the economy well, Paul, and we turned out that there was even more to do than we thought there was after 9 years of you.
So
But
you
seriously,
inherit-
in that
you inherit a whole lot of surpluses and you think it's
in
your
that
own work?
budget, in that budget, we reduced it down. And we were able to post a surplus as well, and we spent that money.
You doubled
There's
your
nothing
spending
wrong with
within
that,
1
Paul.
year.
I'll just stop you both there because I actually want to give you both another chance to talk because it's time for your second questions. Robertson, I'll let you go first. What's your second question?
So, Paul, how much money do you think you will need for the core health budget in your first budget?
Well, that's something we'll have to wait and look at when we see the actual numbers. But
So,
we'll
fun
invest
fact,
what we need to invest in what
the
we've
costs
got
of running the health
We've already
system increased by
announced, some
about
extra spending for
4%
pharmac,
per
for the
year,
drugs that
and
have
that's
helped
without
keep New
doing
Zealanders alive.
anything.
We've already
spending
announced
extra. Core spending
and
and
we have
health.
got a large amount of money set aside in our capital fund for building new hospitals over
Core
the next
spending
decade.
for the operating
and then
of
the
our
core
hospitals. How
operating
much?
allowance,
How much?
we've got at least 800 million set aside, but I've
That's
no
for
doubt.
everything.
Yeah,
That's
but
not just for health.
I've got no doubt. When we look at the numbers, we will see that there will be also many, many areas where we can
No.
find extra resources within the next 12 months. And if there's anything COVID related, of course, we've got an extra $2 billion set aside under the COVID fund.
And your question for Grant Robertson?
Well, Grant, how much is it going to cost New Zealanders to reach your 2030 100% electricity renewable?
We actually have to look at this as an investment in our future.
No.
Paul.
How much
so
is it
we've
going to
got
cost?
We've got a $30 million business case fund
Well, that's
to
nothing.
look at the Lake Onslow project.
Yep.
But actually, the cost that you're talking about, the cost to consumers, is because the previous estimates haven't had the ability for us to store the way that we would be able to with a pumped hydro scheme.
The
So
Climate
all
Change
the
Commission,
waters,
which
just
the
so people understand, all
government
the water's
set
gonna
up,
go down the
Labor
river,
set up, have
and then you're
advised
gonna
them
catch
to
it and then
drop
pump it
that
back up the
target
river,
and focus
then pump
on
it down the river.
transport
And you
and
don't think that's
process
gonna be an
heat
expensive
instead.
exercise,
Of course,
Paul
it's a-
Goldsmith is right on
course
this
it's
one.
billions of dollars. So where's
Of
it going to
course,
come
it's
from?
a
And why haven't you
major
budgeted?
project, but that's the reason why we've got capital allowances, Paul. We've got $7.8 billion worth of capital
There's so
allowances
many
going.
low-hanging fruit
But
that we
the
should
fact-
focus
But the
on
fact
rather
that
than
you
go
don't
chasing
see that
rainbows
it's
with these
important
sorts
for
of
New Zealand to be able to live there.
projects.
You just said before that we trade in the world on a clean green image. We've actually got to do things that back up that
And there's
we've
image.
already
plenty
got
we
one
can
of the
do.
high-
There's so much we can do without
Highest
leaping
renewable
into that
electricity sectors in the
particular
world, about
massive
85%.
project.
And we can go
But
there.
to
So much more technology might come out in the next decade, and then that might be a waste of time. Is this my internet crashing now? What's going on?
We're the
100%
and then we're the
is
home of green
reckless and
hydrogen. Paul.
ideology.
We're the home of green hydrogen, which we've already got Obayashi and another Japanese
that's good.
company here in New Zealand
That's
investing in because we've got that reputation, but we can't rest on our laurels.
We are going to move into some quick-fire questions about the latest economic data. I've been looking forward to this, so
I bet you have.
very much so. So I'll start with I'd like both of you to answer them, but I'll just start with one of you and then move to the other. So,
Is this some sort of quiz? Are we on?
oh yes, yeah,
Oh,
very
right,
much
okay.
a quiz. So Grant Robertson, what is the current New Zealand dollar, US dollar exchange rate?
Oh, I haven't looked at it for a few days, but it was around
0.66.
64 when I last looked at it.
Paul
Yeah,
Goldsmith?
around 65 or something.
67. So,
Okay, I'm close.
Hey,
all right. Close up. Very good. What is the current gender pay gap?
it's about 12%.
As a percentage term or a dollar
The
term?
percentage term.
15%.
It's a little bit lower than that. It's about 11.
It's actually on the Ministry for Women's website, taken from Stats NZ, it's 9.5% for the
geez, I
general,
was a bit
the
pessimistic.
general rate.
I think that's
it
a
hasn't
bit
moved for a few years though. It's not going down very fast. A barrel of Brent crude.
I know that Treasury always forecasted at $60, and it's been considerably lower than that, but 60 is what they forecasted at.
Oh, it's, I think
It's about
it's
30
around 30,
at the
around
moment,
25,
yeah.
30, I think, at the moment.
$42 US 42.
Oh, okay.
US 42.
Jeez.
The average yield on a 10-year Treasury bond.
Oh,
0.5.
negative.
You know, we
Point-
had some,
point
we had
one.
some that were in negative the other day, so the average yield would be 0.7, 0.5.
Yeah, 0.54. So, you know.
Okay, the average,
No,
not the
well done.
most recent.
Well done to you both.
Well done, New Zealand.
Exactly. Right. So our final section, housing, assets and monetary policy. So I'd like to look at 2030 Jacinda Ardern made a speech yesterday talking about where the country would be in 2030. But I would like to talk about where asset prices will be then, because the picture isn't pretty.
No.
You've both got rangatahi in your life. You've got children and grandchildren. Now, when it comes time for them to
I haven't
buy...
got grandchildren.
I do.
Grant Robertson's grandchildren. When it comes time for them to buy their first homes, will you or your wider family be helping them out with a deposit, do you think?
Look, I'm already in that position now, and it is, it's very challenging for people at the moment to be able to do that. It's the reason why we do have to get on top of building far more houses and making sure that we do support a different range of ways of people getting in to the housing market, and that includes things like progressive home ownership. It includes making sure that we support people to be able to use their KiwiSaver and be able to put that towards a deposit.
But in your family, do you think you'll have to personally?
I don't know, but it is something.
Well, that's
that
going to
people
pump
do.
housing
Clearly
demand
what we
even
want is a
higher,
position where
Grant.
people don't feel they need to do that, and certainly those whose families
Down the cost of housing,
Paul Goldsmith,
not
will you
help
be
people
helping out
to
your children?
reach
Well, I just
unaffordable
noticed.
housing.
This Labor government, they're great at slogans. Let's keep moving. We went hard and slow, all that sort of stuff.
Strong team.
I think the right slogan is, Labor. It's the thought that counts. But because when it comes to their housing policy, they've had great intentions. 3 years ago, they were going to change the world. They're going to build all the Kiwi build, and it's been a complete fiasco. And prices have gone up.
So do you think you'll have to help out your kids when it comes time?
Oh well.
Prices went up under national too.
No, I think
Paul.
they'll be very successful and stand on their own 2 feet. I'm really looking forward. I'm very confident they'll do well.
You've seen house prices in Epsom recently?
Yeah.
All right. Well, the reason that I ask is that house prices are rising and they're expected to continue rising.
Yeah.
In August, the median house price was 16% higher than the year before.
This is in a recession, folks. It's
$675,000
crazy.
to REINZ, and in Auckland, it's $950,000.
It's gone up 27% in the last 3 years.
Yes, well, if house prices continue to rise at 6% a year, so much less than the last
It
year,
doubled under the last
average home in New
Labour
Zealand would be
government,
$1.2
national
million
government.
by 2030. In Auckland, that house would cost, the median house would be $1.7 million. Now, wage growth is lagging far
Nearly
behind.
in range of the wealth tax from the Greens. I'll just put that up.
Give it a
They're coming through.
I think that's part of their idea.
Yeah. Well, that's true. That's the point. That's the point. We'll all be paying it before you know it.
With wage growth lagging well behind at 3% growth a year, which is faster than wages are expected to grow, the median wage would be $80,000 in Auckland, about $100,000. A lot of that is thanks to monetary policy. Interest rates are being pushed lower, which pushes up asset prices. Now, last week, the Reserve Bank discussed how it was going to try and push retail lending rates lower through its funding for lending scheme. That will push lending rates lower. It will mean assets get more expensive. It could be rolled out before Christmas. Grant Robertson, you and your leader have both called for house prices to stabilise, for incomes to catch up. That's not what the Reserve Bank is saying. Who wins?
Well, obviously the Reserve Bank's independent, and they have the ability to say
Should
what
they
they
be
need
though,
to say
Grant?
in order to, or do what they need to do rather, in order to meet their goals within the legislation. What we've got to do, and there is no single silver bullet here. We've got to be able to be building far more houses far more quickly. We've got to be able to be using modular housing. We've got to be reforming the RMA to make sure that there's more ability for people to be able to build. And there is work to be done on the demand side as well. And that's why, for example, we extended the Bright Line test out to 5 years, which the National Party now want to bring back to 2 years. It's the reason why we've ring-fenced rental losses. It's the reason why we put the ban on offshore buyers. So all of those things go together, as well as lifting wages to be able to get.
And all
the
those
ratio
things
better
are
than it is.
not
But it is
gonna
not a
be
quick fix. It is a
enough.
decade-long problem that has grown, decades-long problem that has grown up in New Zealand, and all of those
3
parts of the
decades.
puzzle have to be put
But
together.
you notice that the two things that they have actually done were both putting in new taxes. I mean, they're good at doing that, but everything else they failed.
But Paul, it's both sides of the fence here. So that actually the Bright Line test was something that National brought in
and you
at
extended
2
it.
years, and we extended it because we actually wanted to make sure that we disincentivise
And in 3
people
years,
flipping a property
3
other
years
than
you've made
their
no
family
progress
home.
on the RMA or anything else.
I do want to bring the topic back to monetary policy.
Yeah.
Pardon me. But, it's, but you are in conflict with the Reserve Bank here. They are saying that they want asset prices to rise, and
Yes.
you and your leader have said that you don't want that,
Well,
and that is a conflict. So it isn't clear who wins.
Monetary
Well, no,
policy
I just don't see
and tax
it
and
as that
welfare
kind of
system are
conflict.
working
But it is. Either they
completely
rise or they
opposite each
fall.
other.
Well, no,
That's
but it's more about what you're saying, because asset prices rising or falling can be a consequence of monetary policy. Monetary policy is about controlling inflation and making sure that we keep maximum sustainable employment in the economy. So yes, there is that. The bit that governments do then is come in and make sure that we do build more houses and that we do help manage demand, and that's what we're doing.
And so if Adrian Orr, the Reserve Bank governor, calls you up, before his next MPS and says, Minister, I need you to indemnify to more LSAT, more money printing, what would your response be?
Well, look, we continue to have those conversations, and there's a reason why the indemnity is there. I mean, obviously, the bank can control what it does, but ultimately, it all ends up on the government's balance sheet. For things like funding for lending, you can have criteria around funding for lending about what that's actually for and what it goes towards. So those are the conversations that have to take place. But we do have to remember that New Zealand has independent monetary policy. It's the fiscal policy initiatives that we have to be able to put in place to be able to both support that and make them mutually
And Grant, you are
reinforced.
letting the
Would you have a
Reserve Bank
conversation with Adrian Orr
import
about the
failed
funding
policies
for
from
funding?
overseas.
But it has to be.
They have
one of
no
the things that we've
choice.
agreed
They
as
have
part
no
of our
other
protocol
tools,
is as
'cause
we
you
move
won't
through
give it to
what
them.
we used to call unconventional monetary policy, that there are discussions about whether or not those tools get used. But those are tools that are in the toolkit of the Reserve Bank Governor and the Monetary Policy Committee, who do have independence.
Would you ever use something like Section 12 of the Reserve Bank Act to sort of issue a directive to the governor to
There's
say,
a
hey, look, you
very,
are...
very high threshold to do that. And, I'm just old enough to remember, one of Paul's former leaders, Robert Muldoon, and what happened in terms of New Zealand. And so we do have to be very careful about whether or not we invoke those sorts of clauses.
Right. So
Time for a
Paul
rethink
Goldsmith,
on this
to you now,
stuff,
asset
folks.
prices. Do you back what the Reserve Bank has been doing with this unconventional monetary policy? Would you have signed those indemnities?
Yes, ultimately we're following an international path.
Which has
that.
failed.
It's hard to swim against international currents and not have real consequences for the dollar, and so they have to do these things, but nobody's quite clear what the outcome of it all will be. And the reality is, though, that if
It's
you're going
pretty
to
clear. We just look overseas, Paul.
borrow money and spend it as a government, the basic priority has to be making sure that you get good quality things for the money. That's the quality
Yes.
of the spending that counts, and then ultimately that you have a path to get back on top of the debt. But I do worry
Your
about the
quality
asset
of
price
spending
inflation
is
that we're seeing
even
all around
worse
the world.
than
And the best
Grant's.
response to it, because the biggest asset that most New Zealanders have is their house, and the best response is to do everything you can to reduce the cost of producing new houses and increase the supply.
You were a critic last year of some of the Reserve Bank's measures to shore up the banking system, the long-term stability of the banking system. They are on hold, but they will be implemented soon. Are you still a sceptic of those?
I wouldn't say I was a sceptic. The point that we were making is that it wasn't clear to us that the process was as robust as it could have been.
Obviously the banks, the whole financial system is under much more pressure now than it was a year ago.
This is probably not the time for adding extra pressure.
Right, but it's also probably a time to make sure that your banks are safe.
Yes, indeed. And they've got through the global financial crisis in reasonable shape, and they appear to be doing reasonably well now. But it's a dangerous world that we're living in. There's no question about that.
What would you say is your party's cornerstone housing policy in terms of house prices?
Yeah, well, the absolute focus on actually getting on with RMA reform to free up supply. It's not just the RMA, of course, but that is an important part. The way that councils
National's
operate is
approach
important.
They sprawl all over the Bombay Hills
we
and
have a
Canterbury
culture
Plains.
that is very risk averse and adding an enormous
not
cost to
affordable
building
housing.
housing. So a real focus on that area. Now, people will say, "Oh, well, you've been promising to reform the RMA for many years, and we never had the numbers." And Labor never supported us, and New Zealand First never supported us, and. So everybody now agrees that the RMA needs to be rebuilt and restarted on. The only difference is that I can guarantee if Labor does it, they'll make it worse.
Absolute nonsense.
Well, you will make it worse. And
but
look
actually,
at,
we've
look
done
how
things
you've
that,
operated at
you
Igu
never did. The
for
National
example.
Policy Statement on Urban Development actually means that councils have a proper blueprint to work to be able to develop sustainable cities, not ones that sprawl out, but ones that are sustainable. That didn't happen. Under
And
the
neither of you
lines
actually want to
the
give
law.
them the money need to invest in the infrastructure they need to do that.
Will support
neither
more house
National nor
building,
Labour
more
want to do
apartment
that.
building in our cities, along with the bigger changes to the RMA. And actually, there are some differences there. I mean, we're talking about a Strategic Planning Act and a Natural and Built Environment Act. Those two pieces of legislation will be vitally important. I'm not clear that that's actually what you are
And one of the
proposing.
useful things that this government has done on housing is continued the work that we started with the Crown Infrastructure Partners to get infrastructure built. Because one of the reasons why councils are very slow to sign off new housing subdivisions is that they can't afford for the pipes and the roads. And so new ways of funding that.
Again, which we did in 3 years. We passed the infrastructure funding and financing
on the
act
work we started.
inside 3 years.
We
you didn't do it though.
No,
you didn't do it. We passed it.
We started
inside
it with
the 3
Milldale
years.
and we made some real progress. But look, there has to be an absolute focus on reducing the cost of producing new houses. And the reality is that over the years, New Zealand, both parties, have, for a whole host of individual reasons that make sense, added enormous cost to the building of houses in this country, and we need to have an absolute focus on reducing
The general measure of housing and affordability is the median multiple. That's the
We're going
number,
to
the
sort
multiple
out
of the house
building
price
code
to your,
and
the median
building
income.
supplies, Paul.
Will either of you commit to
Competition
making
policy.
some progress towards reducing that gap in your tenure? We have long governments in New Zealand. Over
Has to be the absolute
Of course,
focus.
and we absolutely want to do that. Being able to put a specific number and percentage and ratio on it is tough, particularly in the COVID era, but of course we do. And it's a ratio, which means it's about lifting wages as well as getting that sustained moderation in house prices.
But wages would have to rise astronomically.
Yeah, but it both have to
Where
move,
does the
is the
money come
point that
from?
I'm making.
Right, but I mean, how much money do you think businesses have to be able to pay someone, what, $200,000 in order to afford a house?
No, but as we say, and look, but there are other means that we're supporting that through things like KiwiSaver, through the Home Start grants and others. So there are
That's
a
all
range
just
of
gonna
ways that we're
stoke
supporting
demand,
people
Grant.
into that position. I just think it's
Push
really
prices
important.
higher.
There is no silver bullet on housing. It has to
But
be
3 years
a
ago you were
long-term
saying
plan.
there was a silver
No,
bullet.
we
And
weren't.
you do need to be held
You're
accountable
the one
for
who's
that.
saying
That's
that.
true,
You
Paul.
We never said
It
that.
is
We
true.
said that Kiwi Build was part of our plans.
No.
No,
It
Kiwi
is
Build
still part of
Twyford
our
was gonna
plans,
solve all the
along
problems.
with all of the
Phil
you're
Twyford
the
was
one
gonna fix
saying that,
everything.
Paul, not me.
And normally, at the end of a 3-year term, the election's about holding the government to account for progress that they've made on their promises. And when you run through it, when you run through
public,
Kiwi Build,
more
when you run
public
through light
housing than
rail,
any
when you run through
government
the
since
provincial
the
roads,
1970s.
when you run through all the things that they haven't done, it's a pretty lean line out.
Paul Goldsmith, we'll jump in there. That's all we have time for the formal debate part of this evening. But I'd now like to ask both Paul Goldsmith and Grant Robertson to deliver a 1-minute closing statement. And Grant Robertson, your camera's over there. We'll start with you.
This election is about making sure that we respond, recover and rebuild from COVID-19. The Labour government, with our support partners, has been able to help New Zealanders through this, through things like the wage subsidy scheme that kept 1.7 million New Zealanders in work. Now we have to take that spirit of the team of 5 million and use it for our recovery and our rebuild. That means investing in jobs, supporting our small businesses, making sure we continue to trade into the world, and looking to future-proof our economy through things like our move to 100% renewable electricity, to make sure that we build on our success in areas like agri-tech and hydrogen energy and create new high-paying jobs. We've got to get the balance right here. We'll be careful with our spending, invest in public services and support New Zealanders to recover and rebuild. Let's keep moving.
And as Grant Robertson got the first call of the debate, we'll let Paul Goldsmith finish. Your camera's over there.
Well, thank you. And New Zealanders, look, we're borrowing about $1 billion a week at the moment, and the Treasury predicts another 200,000 New Zealanders will be out of work in the next couple of years. So we're facing an enormous economic challenge right here, right now. Now, we believe that New Zealand will get back on track. We're a great country. We've got skilled, entrepreneurial people, and we produce things that the world wants. It's just a question of how quickly we get back on track. And our strong conviction is with National's policies, New Zealand will get on its feet again faster. We're going to focus on putting more money in the hands of Kiwis with a short-term tax cut from the 1st of December, putting $3,000 into the hand of an average income earner. And then we'll focus on where jobs actually come from. It's private sector investment, a Kiwi taking on an extra person and providing them a job. And we want to make it easier for firms to hire new people and to not keep on adding costs onto their shoulders. And then on infrastructure, we'll invest in quality infrastructure that makes the country more productive and gets us ahead.
I find it astounding
Thank you
that.
both. And thank
I mean,
you
that's
all
the kind
for
of
tuning in
finish I'd
to
expect
the
from
Stuff Finance
a
debate.
national
We would
finance
really like to thank
spokesperson.
everyone who
But
worked
grants
hard to
really
put this
sounded
debate
light
together.
blue.
Now remember,
They really
you
have
can all
become
vote up
quite
until 7 p.m.
conservative
this Saturday.
under this
And we'd like to thank both Labor's
administration.
finance spokesman and finance
And what I
minister Grant
really need
Robertson
to
this
impress
evening.
upon people is that neither Labour nor National are
And
really
we would
doing
like
the
to
due
thank,
diligence on these
National
massive
Finance spokesman,
infrastructure
the man who'd like
projects
to
that
take his
they
job,
are
Paul Goldsmith.
proposing. We need to make sure they have business cases that actually
And this is really
stack
important,
up
because we'd like to thank
and
them both
prepare
for
us
fronting
for a
up today
future
and telling
economy.
you, our
That's
viewers,
the
how they would
major
preside over
thing.
New
This
Zealand's
COVID
economy,
recovery
how
is
they
an
would start
incredible
getting New Zealand's
opportunity.
economy rebuilt
We need to
as we
seize it,
recover
make
from
sure we
COVID.
make the right investments. Kia ora.